Tonight we step back into a quiet corner of history, a world hidden in shadow, whispers, and careful reflections. It's 1950s Chicago, and in the gentle hours of the night we meet Frank, a man caught between loyalty, duty, and the quiet voice within. This sleep story is calm, historically grounded, and introspective, crafted to help you relax, unwind, and drift softly into restful sleep. So, breathe easy and join Frank as he walks his careful path through a life quietly lived on the edge. Frank liked the city best when it was quiet, those few, rare hours just after dawn when Chicago seemed to catch its breath. The streets empty, the buildings still, even the trains on the elevated tracks ran softer, as if trying not to wake anyone who wasn't ready. He was 33 but felt older most days. His knuckles bore scars he rarely noticed, and he walked with the slow certainty of someone who knew the city better than it knew itself. Each morning he stopped at the corner diner on Ashland, coffee black, eggs scrambled, toast dry. It was a ritual. He didn't talk much, but the waitress, Marge, knew him. She brought his plate, refilled his cup, and never asked how his night had been. Frank appreciated that. Today, it was raining, thin, gray sheets drifting down, muting the colors of the street and turning the world quiet. Frank watched it from the diner window, spoon stirring slow circles into his coffee. He'd grown used to quiet mornings like this. They helped soften the memory of loud nights, of too bright streetlights, and whispered orders behind locked doors. He knew the city by its corners, its alleys, its unspoken rules. The work wasn't glamorous, mostly waiting, watching, making sure things happened when and how they should. He rarely raised his voice, rarely had to. The city listened when he whispered. When breakfast was finished, he laid the exact change on the counter, nodded once to Marge, and stepped outside. The rain felt good on his face, cleansing somehow, washing away the traces of yesterday. He walked without hurry, taking the long route, letting the quiet sink into his bones before the noise of the day took over. He knew it would come soon enough. But for now, in the quiet hours, he could pretend the ledger he balanced every night didn't weigh so heavy. In a small notebook he carried, Frank wrote a single line. Rain quiets everything, even the past. Then he tucked it away, breathing in the morning slowly, step by gentle step. Frank hadn't walked his old block in years. It wasn't far, just a few turns off Cicero, tucked behind a shuttered church with faded brick and boarded stained glass. But time had made it feel distant. He didn't come here often. Too many eyes, too many memories. Still, something had pulled him that morning. The sidewalk was cracked in the same places. The corner stoop still leaned a little. The smell was the same, too, wet stone, diesel, and something faintly sweet from the bakery that had somehow survived 2 generations and 3 owners. He slowed at the fence of the building he used to call home. Back then, his mother would leave the window cracked, even in winter. Said the air kept the walls from closing in. Frank never understood that until years later, standing in rooms with no windows, no exits, and men who talked like the world owed them something. The building looked tired now. Peeling paint, curtains drawn. But he could still picture the door swinging open at dusk, his brother running down the steps, his mother yelling behind him, and the way the streetlight buzzed as the sky turned blue-gray. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing the edge of a worn photograph. He didn't take it out, just held it for a moment, then let go. The past had a way of hanging around in Chicago. In the corners. In the silence between footsteps. Frank didn't try to chase it away, but he didn't invite it in either. As he walked back toward the main road, the sounds of the city began to return. Car horns, shop doors slamming, the low rattle of the L train overhead. Life still moving. Frank lit a cigarette with a matchbook from a bar that didn't exist anymore. And in his notebook he wrote, "The street remembers, even if you don't." Then he folded the page closed and kept walking. Frank didn't like carrying things. Not because they were heavy. He was built for weight, both literal and not, but because carrying something meant trust. And in his world, trust was rare. Risky. Still, that morning he had a small job to do. Not flashy, not dangerous, just a pickup and a handshake. A reminder, quiet presence was often louder than shouting, if you knew how to do it right. He walked south along Pulaski, coat collar turned against the drizzle. The shop was unmarked, a tailor's storefront from the outside, but no one went there for suits. Inside, the bell above the door jingled like any other neighborhood place. The man behind the counter was ironing a pressed shirt with exaggerated care. Didn't look up when Frank entered. "You're early," the man said. Frank didn't answer. Just stepped closer, opened his coat slightly. A flash of leather and metal, no weapons, just credentials. Not official ones. The kind that meant you were allowed to ask for something once and only once. The man nodded, tapped twice on the counter. From a back room, a box emerged, ordinary looking, taped shut, labeled with an address Frank didn't read. He didn't need to know. He never needed to know. They didn't shake hands. They didn't speak again. Frank left with the box under one arm, the drizzle still falling, the traffic light blinking on a rhythm older than either of them. He dropped the box off at a newsstand on Roosevelt, gave a nod, got one in return. No names, no questions, just movement. That was the work most days. Not shootouts or screaming, just steps and eyes and knowing when not to be seen. At lunch, Frank ate alone. Same stool, same plate, roast beef on rye, half-sour pickle, ginger ale. He liked knowing what to expect. It was the one part of his day no one could rewrite. He scribbled in his notebook, "No one notices the man who walks with purpose. But they always notice when he stops." And then he turned the page and left it blank. There was a rhythm to the meetings. Always the same two men, one car, one corner. Never more than 15 minutes. No eye contact with pedestrians. No unnecessary movement. Keep it clean, keep it quiet. Frank wasn't in the meeting. He was on the roof above it, crouched behind a vent, coat damp from the earlier rain, cigarette in one hand and binoculars in the other. He didn't need the optics to see. He knew the silhouettes, the way one of them always scratched his jaw when he lied, the way the other checked his watch every 3 minutes, like he didn't trust the moment. The alley behind Calo's Italian Market was one of the oldest drop spots in the city, been used for everything from bookie cash to apology notes from out-of-town guys who messed up. Frank had stood on this same roof 2 years ago, watching different men say the same words in different voices. It never really changed. He listened for tone, not words. He watched for weight shifts, not hand gestures. That's what saved lives in their world, reading the space between what people said. The men finished early. No briefcase, no envelope, just a nod and a handshake that didn't quite look finished. Frank frowned. Back in his apartment, hours later, he sat with the silence. It was small, studio with 2 windows, 1 working lamp, and a chair that creaked if you leaned too far to the left. But it was clean, and it was his. The rain had started again. He poured himself a drink, not out of habit, but out of ritual. 1 finger of bourbon, 1 cracked ice cube, and no music. He liked the quiet. Frank opened his notebook, paused, then wrote, "The real things aren't said. They shift between shoulders and silence." He closed it, left it on the nightstand, and stared out at the lights blinking red and green down below. Frank hadn't seen Leo in a few months. Not because anything was wrong, just because time had that way of stretching between people in their line of work. 1 week you shared a drink, the next you were hearing about them through someone else, in whispers too cautious to sound like concern. But Leo had called, asked for lunch. Same place as always, Sammy's on South Halsted. Cash-only red booths, jukebox that hadn't worked since '51. Frank arrived early. He always did. Leo came in, wearing a windbreaker 2 sizes too big and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His hair had more silver now. His laugh was softer. They didn't hug, just nodded and sat. No talk for the first few minutes. Just sandwiches, slaw, a pot of coffee they both knew would taste like burnt rubber. Then, over a bite of pastrami, Leo said, "You ever think about quitting?" Frank chewed slowly. "Quitting what?" You know what? Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched a couple at the corner booth arguing about a crossword puzzle. The woman pointed at a clue like it owed her money. I think about getting quiet, Frank said finally. Not quitting. Leo smirked. You're still good at dodging. Still alive, too. They both smiled at that. It wasn't just small talk. There was something under Leo's words, a tightness around his jaw, a nervous flick of his eyes toward the window every few minutes. He was testing the water. Frank didn't press. He never did. He just paid the bill, left too much tip, and told Leo to call if he needed anything. Then he walked 3 blocks in silence, thinking about the question that hadn't really been a question. That night in his notebook, Frank wrote, "Some men leave loud. Some leave quiet. Most don't leave at all." Then he stared at the words until they blurred and closed the book. It was waiting for him when he got home. Just a small envelope, no markings, no name, tucked under the mat like a newspaper that no one had ordered. Frank didn't need to open it to know what it was. He recognized the fold of the paper. The weight, it was the same kind used for gentle warnings, a term no one said out loud, but everyone understood. Inside a photograph, slightly blurred, a man crossing a street. Frank in the background out of focus, watching. No note. There didn't need to be. He didn't panic, didn't rush to the phone or draw the blinds. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at the table. He looked at the photo again. Whoever took it wanted him to see it, which meant they didn't want him gone. Not yet. Just rattled. Just reminded. The kind of move someone makes when they think they know the rules better than you do. Frank had played that game before. He opened his notebook, flipped past the pages with quiet phrases and grocery lists and memories scratched like poetry. He wrote, "A real warning comes without pictures. This is theater, and I don't attend shows." Then he made a phone call, not to retaliate, but to observe. A quiet man at a quiet payphone. Just passing along a message, next time, send something real. The next morning, the same steps were clean. No envelope, no photo. Just a quiet city stretching out in the morning light, and a man who understood the difference between fear and respect. It used to be his. Not on paper, not officially, but in practice. The back room above the tavern on 24th and Wentworth. A place for whispers and bottle caps and quick glances toward the stairs. It was where he learned how to listen, how to wait, how to make a name without saying it too loud. Now someone else sat behind the desk. Younger guy. Shoot. Too much cologne. Frank knocked once and walked in without waiting. The new guy blinked. Didn't know you were coming. You weren't supposed to. That threw him off. Good. Frank didn't sit, just stood by the window, watching the rain streak the glass. Same view he'd looked out of 20 years ago, back when he thought respect was something you earned with fists or fear. He was wrong then. And maybe this kid was wrong now. "I'm not here to tell you how to run it," Frank said. But if you're going to use my old room, at least understand what it was for." The kid leaned back. "Which was?" Frank turned from the window. Quiet decisions, not loud ones. He didn't stay long. Didn't need to. The message landed, even if the kid pretended it didn't. There was weight in presence. Frank had it. The room still remembered. On his way out, he passed the old mirror in the hallway. Same crack in the corner. Same smudge no one ever cleaned. He caught his reflection. Looked tired. Looked steady. Looked like someone who had lasted. That night in his notebook he wrote, "The room doesn't forget who built it, even if the furniture changes." And he closed the book, listening to the quiet tap of rain against the windows. There were men you worked for, and then there were men you listened to. Louis was the second kind. He never raised his voice, never had to. When he entered a room, even the clatter of silverware seemed to pause. He hadn't run anything in over a decade, but people still called him Boss Louis out of habit or respect. Frank could never tell which. Louis lived above a hardware store now. Said he liked the smell of wood and nails, said it reminded him that things could be fixed. Frank brought a bottle. Nothing fancy, just enough to say I remember. "Still slow?" Louis asked from his recliner. Still slow, Frank replied. They didn't talk about business, not directly. It was all stories, memories disguised as lessons. Names not mentioned, but understood. Louis had a way of talking around things that made you feel like you'd arrived at the truth, all on your own. You still write in that little book? He asked after a while. Frank nodded. Keep doing that. Most of us forget the right parts, or remember 'em too clean. They sat in silence after that. No rush? No need for more. As he stood to leave, Louis said, You'll know when it's time. For what? Louis didn't answer. Just smiled and turned back to his radio, where an old Sinatra tune hummed low. Frank walked back under a sky heavy with clouds. His steps slow, not because he was tired, but because some visits ask you to walk gently afterward, like carrying a full glass of something you don't want to spill. In his notebook that night he wrote, The best men don't teach with orders. They teach by staying soft in a hard room. Then he placed the notebook beside his keys, poured himself a glass of water, and left the radio on low until he fell asleep. It was a winter night, long time ago. Frank had been younger then, maybe 25, just starting to build a name, earning trust, the only way it counted, by not messing up. He was running pickups mostly, nothing glamorous, but that night had stuck with him. He was supposed to collect an envelope. Simple. But the man who handed it off looked shaken. New, not street-born, not from the fold. You sure you want to be in this line of work? Frank had asked, not out of concern, just surprise. The kid had nodded, eyes wide, hands shaking. Frank took the envelope, nodded once, and left. 2 weeks later, the kid was gone. No story, no headline. Just gone. Frank didn't remember his name. But he remembered the way the air felt that night, how it cut sharp through his coat, how the alley had smelled like motor oil and fresh snow, how his boots had echoed too loudly on wet pavement. That was the first time Frank understood that there were no small jobs, just smaller prices to pay. Now, all these years later, he still walked past that alley sometimes. Didn't mean to, but he always glanced down it. And he always slowed. He passed it again this week, heading home from a meeting that hadn't needed to happen. Just two guys pretending something still mattered. It was late and the street was empty. The alley looked the same. Frank stopped. Lit a cigarette. Didn't walk down. Didn't turn away. Just stood there, remembering something he'd never told anyone. In his notebook that night he wrote, Some debts aren't owed in dollars. Some debts are the weight you carry for staying quiet. Then he crossed the line out. Then rewrote it. It was always phrased like that. Never a job, never a task. Just, can you do me a favor? And Frank never said no. Not because he couldn't, but because in his world keeping score was silent, and favors were the currency that bought safety, trust, and sometimes survival. This one came late. A knock on the door just past midnight. 2 taps, 1 pause. The kind of knock that meant it wasn't urgent, but it couldn't wait until morning. Frank opened the door already dressed. The kid standing there couldn't have been more than 20. Nervous energy in every twitch. Kept shifting his weight like he didn't trust the ground. He handed Frank a note, crumpled and folded 3 ways. Frank didn't read it right away. Just asked, where? Old rail yard on 39th. Frank nodded. Didn't ask what or why. Didn't need to. The rail yard was half frozen, the kind of silence that buzzed in your ears because there was nothing to muffle. Rows of rusted-out cars, a few blinking lights, the long, slow groan of a wind that carried every mistake you'd ever made. Frank waited. The favor turned out to be simple. Stand there, watch, make sure something didn't happen, or that if it did, someone would remember it right. He stood there for an hour. Nothing did happen, which meant it was a good night. By the time he got home, it was nearly 3 a.m. He hung his coat by the door, sat down without turning on the light. Let the quiet wrap around him like an old coat. Then he reached for his notebook and wrote, The job isn't the job. It's what it asks of your sleep. He didn't underline it, didn't read it twice. Just closed the book and sat in the dark, waiting for morning. It came in the mail. No return address, no stamp. Just a plain envelope slipped into the usual pile of bills and junk. The kind of envelope that didn't ask to be opened. It waited. Frank took it to the kitchen table, sat down with a cup of black coffee, and stared at it for a long minute. The handwriting was familiar. Sharp, fast strokes, tight spacing, a left-hander's slant. He knew it before he opened it. It was from Rosie. Not Rosie the girl, not Rosie the waitress. Rosie the decision Frank hadn't made in time. She'd been gone a long while now. Moved to California, married a man who wore shirts without collars, sent postcards twice before vanishing completely. Frank had always meant to write back. Never did. The letter was short. Just a few lines. I saw something the other day that made me think of you. A man leaning on a diner counter, not talking, not waiting. Just there. You always knew how to be there. I hope you still are. No signature. Just that. Frank sat for a long while after reading it. Didn't move. Didn't sip his coffee. He just stared at the words and let them echo. Later, he walked to the park, something he hadn't done in weeks. It was cold, but the air felt clean. The kind that wrapped around your ribs and made you feel like breathing. Could do more than keep you alive. In his notebook, he wrote, "Some people don't leave. They just stop showing up." Then he closed the book, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled at a stranger passing by. They called themselves the Crew, like it meant something. Frank watched them from across the street, leaning against a lamppost, coat collar turned up against the chill. They were younger, louder, always half smiling like they had something to prove. 3 of them, pacing in front of a club they weren't old enough to remember before it had changed names. He didn't know them, but they knew of him. You could tell by the way one of them kept glancing over, nervous, like a man walking past an old church he didn't believe in but still respected. The thing was, Frank didn't mind them. They dressed sharper than his generation ever had, laughed louder, got things done with fewer words. But what they hadn't learned yet was silence, patience, the kind of stillness that got you through a night without getting your hands dirty. They moved like they'd never been tired. Frank moved like he knew exactly how much energy the world was worth. He crossed the street slow. One of the kids nodded. "Mr. Vale," he said, more question than greeting. Frank nodded back. "Don't call me that. I'm not a judge." A couple of them chuckled, the kind of laugh people make when they're not sure if they've been insulted. "You boys know the rules?" Frank asked. One of them shrugged, mostly. "Then learn the rest." No threats, no advice, just a tone that settled in behind their ribs and stayed there. He walked past them and didn't look back. The lesson wasn't in the warning. It was in the walk. At home, he wrote in his notebook, "The young talk like the street is theirs. The old walk like they built it." He didn't feel bitter, just tired, and maybe just a little proud. The cemetery sat out west, past the city's voice, beyond where the skyline gave up trying. A flat stretch of trimmed grass, iron gates, and headstones that tilted with time. Frank went alone. He always did. Not for mourning. He wasn't one to cry, not even when the men around him did. He came to remember, not just the faces, but the rules. The decisions, the lines not to cross, the ones he had crossed, and the ones that blurred. He found the headstone he'd come for. Anthony Tony No-Neck Marino. The nickname was carved into the granite, just like Tony had asked. Frank shook his head. "Still a showman," he muttered. They'd run numbers together in the early days. Tony liked jazz, Italian food, and overstepping. Got himself caught between 2 crews playing at politics, and ended up where most men like that do. 6 feet under, and not enough flowers to make up for it. Frank didn't stay long. He never did. But before he left, he knelt down, rested his palm against the cold stone, and whispered, "It should have been different." Then he stood, brushed off his coat, and let the wind carry the rest of what he didn't say. Back in the car, he sat with the radio off. Just the hum of the engine and the soft knock of memory in his chest. In his notebook, he wrote, "Gravestones don't care who remembers, but I do." Then he drove east, toward the city, toward the noise, toward the part of life that still asked him to show up. The bar was dim, the way Frank liked it. Cigarette smoke curled in slow ribbons near the ceiling. The jukebox hummed softly in the corner, some old Dean Martin tune warbling through a scratchy speaker. Frank was meeting Marty. They'd done small jobs together for over a decade. Marty wasn't fast, but he was loyal, or so Frank thought. Marty slid into the booth, nodding like nothing was wrong. That was the first sign. The second sign was the way his eyes didn't settle. They kept moving, like a man trying not to look guilty. Frank didn't say anything for a while. Let the music stretch. Let the tension settle. Then he said, "You took the envelope that wasn't yours." Marty blinked, swallowed hard. "That ain't true, Frank." Frank didn't raise his voice, didn't move, just looked. Marty cracked first. "I needed the cash. Just a little. Figured nobody'd notice." Frank leaned back. "You know better." Silence. Then Marty asked, almost whispering, "You gonna tell them?" Frank stared at him a moment longer, then reached into his coat and pulled out a napkin. Wrote a name, time, place. "Fix it," he said, "or don't come back here." And with that, he stood and left the bar, coat heavy, heart heavier. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "The first time hurts more than the last, because that's the one where you still believed in someone." He closed the book gently, like he was putting away something fragile. The bell above the door gave a soft ring as Frank stepped inside. Dust in the air, afternoon sun cutting through lace curtains. The smell of old wood and polish. It was a place that hadn't changed since the 1940s and probably wouldn't for another 50 years. Frank didn't play piano. He never had. But this shop, tucked between a shoemaker and a shuttered deli, was one of the few places left in the city where the world didn't ask anything of him. The owner, an old man named Irving, nodded once from behind a counter stacked with music books. "Just looking," Frank said as always. Irving smiled. "I know." He moved between the pianos slowly. Uprights, baby grands, keys chipped from use. Each one had its own hum, its own silence. He touched the edge of a worn bench and sat down. Pressed a single key. Middle C. The sound lingered, warm and low. He pressed it again, then again. Same note, but it felt different each time. Years ago, before everything, Frank had been in love with a girl who played piano. She taught him that the key wasn't just about the note. It was about the pause between, the way you listened to the quiet afterward. She left before he ever figured out what that really meant. Frank stood after a while. Left a $10 bill on the counter. "Still don't play," he said. Irving chuckled. "Still doesn't matter." At home in his notebook, Frank wrote, "Some sounds aren't about music. They're about remembering how to breathe." Then he sat back in his chair and let the silence play its part. He was waiting by Frank's building, leaning against the brick like he'd done it before but hadn't. Young, thin, nervous in the hands, looked up too fast when Frank approached. "Frank Vale?" Frank stopped a few feet away. "Who's asking?" The kid straightened his back. "My name's Danny. I'm Sal's nephew." Frank didn't blink. Didn't nod. Just said, "Go on." Sal had been a quiet kind of dangerous. Ran books out of the corner barber shop and made his money 1 percentage point at a time. Dead now. 2 years. Maybe 3. Frank had liked him. Trusted him, which wasn't common. Danny pulled out a folded piece of paper. No letter, just a phone number and a street name written in Sal's sharp, blocky print. He said if anything ever went sideways, come find you. Frank didn't take the paper. Didn't need to. He already knew the address. "You working?" Frank asked. Danny shrugged, trying not to. Frank nodded once, then looked up at the sky as if something might drop an answer down to him. Come back tomorrow, he said. Wear something warmer. Then he turned, walked inside, and didn't look back. That night, the notebook stayed closed. Instead, Frank sat by the window, watching the street below, and wondering how many people got pulled into this life, not because they wanted to, but because no one ever offered them anything else. Danny showed up early. Frank liked that. It meant the kid wasn't just trying to impress, he was nervous. Nervous meant careful. Careful meant alive. They started the day on foot. Frank didn't explain where they were going. He didn't believe in lectures. He believed in presence, in walking the routes and letting the city speak for itself. First stop the bakery on 22nd. Frank always picked up a roll and coffee there, not because it was special, but because it had been safe for 20 years. Safe mattered. He handed Danny a bag with a poppy seed roll. First rule, he said, eat something. You don't think straight when you're hungry. Danny nodded and bit into it like it was his first meal in days. Next, they walked the back alley behind the theater. You see that? Frank said, pointing to a pipe jutting out from the wall. Used to be a camera in there, but not anymore, but the habit stuck. You keep your face down when you walk by. Danny nodded again. Too much nodding, not enough watching. Frank made a mental note of it. They stopped at a bench overlooking the river. It was quiet there, just the hush of traffic far away and the occasional hum of a passing barge. You think this life's about action, Frank said. It's not. Danny didn't say anything. Frank glanced over. The kid was looking at the water. Good. He was listening. When they parted ways that evening, Frank handed Danny a napkin with a time and location. Be there, on time. That was it. No goodbye, no welcome. Just instruction. Just like it had been for him. That night, Frank opened his notebook and wrote, "The men worth keeping never ask what you mean. They learn by watching your silences." Then he folded the book shut and watched the shadows lean across the floor. There was a man Frank used to know, Ricky G. Not Ricky the Knife or Ricky Eyes or any of the nicknames men in the life tended to earn. Just Ricky G. No flair, no reputation. That was the point. Ricky didn't wear nice suits. He didn't drink with the crew. He ran errands, watched corners, delivered messages, never the kind that could be traced, never late, never wrong. One day he stopped showing up. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. Frank hadn't thought about him in years. But something about Danny, his quiet, the way he tried not to speak unless spoken to, reminded Frank of that shadowed figure who used to move through the edges of the room, never interrupting the scene. Ricky had once said to Frank, "You know why I'm still breathing? Because I'm no one's memory." Frank didn't want Danny to be like that. He didn't want him to disappear to survive. But he also didn't know how to teach him otherwise. Not in this city, not in this world, not when men like Ricky were the ones who lasted. That night, Frank passed by an old diner where he and Ricky had once split a sandwich in silence. The booths were gone now. The place had turned into a cell phone store. He didn't go inside, just stood on the curb and remembered. In his notebook, he wrote, "You can be remembered or you can be safe. Some men never get to be both." Then he drew a line under it. Then slowly he wrote, "Danny?" and nothing else. It wasn't a meeting, not officially. But when 3 chairs are set in a room with no windows and the door locks from the inside, it's a sit-down, whether anyone calls it that or not. Frank arrived 5 minutes early. He always did. Time was respect in his world. He wore the same coat he'd had for 15 years. Same shoes, no shine. The 2 men who joined him were newer. Sharp collars, pressed cuffs, the kind of polish that came with not having bled yet. They nodded to him, trying not to seem nervous. But he saw it anyway. "You're wondering why I'm here," Frank said before either of them could open their mouths. They didn't respond. So he answered for them. Because the wrong people are talking too much and the right people are starting to ask who let them. The taller one, Vince maybe, cleared his throat. "It's not like that." "It's always like that," Frank said. He let the silence stretch, not for tension, for space, so they could hear their own thinking. "I'm not here to punish," Frank finally said. "I'm here to remind—" The other one, kid with the too clean haircut, asked, "Remind of what?" Frank leaned forward. That every man who thought he was too small to matter eventually made the whole thing fall. When he stood to leave, they didn't stop him. Didn't ask if he'd be reporting what they said. Because the silence he left behind was louder than anything they could have asked. Back home in his notebook, he wrote, "You don't have to swing the bat. You just have to make them wonder if you still know how." Then he laid the pen down, rubbed the stiffness out of his fingers, and turned the radio on low. The shop smelled like dust and cedar. Bell over the door gave a familiar jingle, same as it had for 30 years. Frank stepped inside, the quiet clicking of his heels muffled by the thick wool carpet. Behind the counter stood Angelo, nearly 90, still measuring cloth like he was preparing suits for ghosts. He didn't greet Frank. Didn't have to. He just nodded once and said, "Still keeping quiet, I see." Frank smiled faintly, louder than most. Angelo motioned for him to step up on the riser. Frank did. The tape measure moved around his shoulders, across his chest, down each arm. No rush, no small talk, just the slow rhythm of a man who'd spent a life dressing others for things they didn't talk about. "You still working?" Angelo asked after a while. "Still walking." Angelo paused at the waist. "You know," he said, "most men leave this life before it fits them properly." Frank didn't answer. Didn't need to. Angelo nodded, continued. The suit was dark gray, subtle pinstripe, conservative but sharp, the kind of suit that didn't draw attention but didn't disappear either. The kind you wore when something important was ending or about to begin. Frank didn't ask the price. He just said Tuesday. "I'll have it ready," Angelo replied. On his way out, Frank touched the frame near the door, an old photo of men shaking hands at a wedding. His father was in it, younger than Frank was now. For a second, it caught in his throat. Then he stepped back into the cold. In his notebook that night, Frank wrote, "You wear a suit for the last time 3 times in your life. Only one of them do you remember?" He capped the pen, set the book on the windowsill, and stood a long time with the light off. She lived in a small apartment above a flower shop in Bridgeport. 2 flights up, no elevator. Still had a rotary phone. Still wrote letters with a fountain pen. Still made lasagna from scratch every Sunday, even if no one came to eat it. Frank hadn't been by in months. He brought tulips. "Wrong season," Lila said, smiling, "but good color." They ate in the kitchen, the same oilcloth on the table she'd had since he was a boy. A tin of sugar cookies sat on the counter, untouched, more for decoration now than anything else. Lila asked about his work, lightly, politely, the way someone asks without expecting an answer. Frank deflected the way he always had. But then she surprised him. "You still keeping track?" He looked up. "In that notebook of yours. It's the one you think no one knows about." He didn't answer right away. Just nodded. Lila poured more coffee. "I don't ask what you do," she said, "but I know the kind of man you are. You're not like your father." Frank said nothing. "You feel everything," she added, "even when you think you don't." After lunch, she sent him home with leftovers and a pressed linen napkin. Said it made the container feel less disposable. Back at his apartment, Frank opened the notebook, but didn't write right away. Eventually, he put down, "The people who don't ask questions are the ones you owe the most to." Then he closed the book and placed it face down on the kitchen counter, like it might say something if left alone. Frank hadn't been to Mass in years. But one Sunday, without planning to, he walked past St. Bernadette's on his way to the bakery, and something made him stop. The heavy doors were open. The smell of old incense drifted out like a ghost from his childhood. So he stepped inside. The place was nearly empty. A few scattered heads bowed in pews. No service in progress. Just the open nave, quiet as snowfall, and the faint creak of wood as he eased down onto the bench near the back. He didn't pray. He wasn't sure he ever had, not in the way they talked about from the pulpit, but he listened, to the hush, to the distant drip of water near the altar, to the thrum of blood in his ears. And in that stillness something inside him uncoiled. He looked at the stained glass windows, saints and martyrs with tilted heads and gentle hands. Their eyes didn't judge, they just watched. Frank thought about all the men who'd walked through those doors after doing worse things than him, and he wondered if any of them had walked out feeling lighter. He didn't stay long, but on the way out he lit a candle, didn't say who it was for, just watched the flame flicker in the wax, small and stubborn. Then he slipped back into the cold. That night in his notebook he wrote, "You don't need faith to believe in silence. Just enough memory to sit with it." And for the first time in a long time, he left the book open when he went to bed. It was just after dusk when Frank saw him, Louis Marchesi, sitting on a bench outside a grocery store on South Halsted, legs crossed, sipping from a styrofoam cup like it was the old days and nobody was counting time. Louis used to run numbers for the Cicero crowd. Sharp dresser, quick fists, faster mouth. Last Frank heard, he'd moved to Miami and married a girl with a laugh like a piano. But there he was, back in Chicago, older and softer around the middle, wearing a windbreaker instead of a blazer. "Frankie," he said, eyes crinkling with real surprise, "you're still standing." "So are you," Frank replied. Louis patted the bench. Frank sat. They didn't talk business. Didn't need to. Louis told stories about Florida humidity, cheap cigars, and his stepson who wanted to be a dentist. Frank nodded, half listening, half watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Then Louis said, "You ever think about getting out?" Frank didn't answer. Louis smiled. "You still think there's a door somewhere, don't you?" Frank looked at him then, really looked. Saw the shake in Louis's hand, the twitch behind his eye. "No doors," Frank said. Louis nodded slowly. "Only walls." They sat in silence for a few more minutes. Then Louis stood, stretched his back, and said, "Well, good to see you, Frankie." Frank didn't say it back. That night in his notebook he wrote, "Some men leave the life. Others just learn to sit still long enough to forget they're still in it." Then he tore the page out, folded it into a square, and lit a match. It was slipped under his door sometime between midnight and dawn. Cream-colored, thick paper, no return address, just his name, handwritten, careful, and clean. Frank stared at it for a long time before picking it up. The hallway was silent, no footsteps, no shadows, just the hum of a building that never slept. Inside the envelope, a photograph. Old, grainy, black and white. 3 men on a sidewalk outside of Richie's barbershop. One of them was Frank, younger, leaner, eyes sharp. Another was Sal, Danny's uncle. The third, he hadn't seen that face in 20 years. Benny Russo. Dead, supposedly. Shot twice in the chest behind the stockroom of a pool hall in '03. Frank remembered because he was the one who made the call to clean it up. Now here he was in a photo that had no business existing. No message. No threat, just the image. But Frank felt the warning as sure as a cold finger down the back of his neck. He placed the photo on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might blink. That night, in his notebook, he wrote nothing. For the first time in months, the page remained blank. Instead, he sat at the table with the photo and a glass of rye, listening for a knock that never came. The next morning, Frank pulled out the old address book from his hall closet. It was thick with dust and yellowed at the corners. Names from another time, scrawled in pencil or fading ink. Most of them crossed out. Some with a single line, others circled twice, either for danger or trust, depending on the mood he was in that day. He flipped to the R's. There it was. B. No number, no street, just a name and a small question mark drawn beside it years ago. Frank tapped the page with the back of his pen. By noon, he was walking through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in over a decade. The brick buildings looked the same. The people didn't. The corner store was now a vape shop. The old shoeshine stand was gone. But one door, blue, paint peeling, still had the same crooked mailbox with a dent in its side. He knocked once. Nothing. He knocked again. A woman opened it, mid-40s, eyes wary. "Looking for Benny," Frank said. Her mouth tightened. "You're a little late." She didn't slam the door. Didn't let him in either. "Dead?" Frank asked. She nodded. "But not when they said he was," she added. "He just wanted out. Went down to Louisiana. Changed his name. Died in a fishing boat fire 3 years back." Frank stared past her, at the peeling paint, the quiet hallway behind. "You close?" "I was his sister," she said. Frank left without another word. But as he walked back through the neighborhood, he realized something. The photo hadn't been about Benny. It had been about Sal. That night, he opened his notebook again. This time he wrote, "You can bury a man's body, but you can't bury a debt." He closed the book, turned off the light, and sat in the dark, waiting for the past to knock again. Frank met with Leo Mancini the way one met with a man like Leo, by showing up at the right bar and waiting until someone said his name. He sat alone in the corner booth of the Brass Penny, an old jazz bar turned holding spot for favors and secrets. The carpet still smelled like smoke from a band that passed 2 decades ago, and the bartender never made eye contact unless your drink was empty. Frank didn't order anything. He just waited. After 30 minutes, someone tapped the table twice. "Mr. Mancini will see you now." The back room wasn't large. 1 table, 2 chairs, a single green lamp casting half shadows across a row of empty whiskey bottles on a shelf. Leo Mancini looked smaller than Frank remembered. Not in presence, but in the way men do when they've had to carry their own legend too long. Frank sat down. No handshake, no smile, just space between them and the memory of things better left unsaid. "You got a picture," Leo said. Frank nodded. Leo didn't ask to see it. Instead, he leaned back and said, "If you're asking whether Sal left mess behind, the answer's yes. The question is what kind?" Frank said nothing. Leo continued, "You weren't supposed to be on cleanup detail, Frank. You were the one they trusted not to dig too deep." "Plans change," Frank said. Leo raised an eyebrow. "You changing sides?" "I'm not on a side. I'm on a path." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Leo said, "If there's trouble coming, it's not just yours. That photo means someone wants a return on something old." "And Danny?" Frank asked. Leo shrugged. "A pawn or an excuse. Depends on the day." Frank stood. "I'm not playing chess." Leo chuckled, low and dry. "You never were. That's why you lasted." Frank paused at the door. "Tell them I'm still breathing." Leo gave a nod that might have meant respect or regret or nothing at all. Outside, the street was quiet. Winter air bit through his coat, but Frank barely noticed. He lit a cigarette, something he hadn't done in over a year, and let the first drag sit on his tongue before releasing it into the cold. Then he walked 3 blocks without looking back. That night in his notebook he wrote, "Every game they said I was too soft to win, I survived by knowing when to walk off the board." He closed it not gently but with intention, and began locking the windows. Frank left the note in the shoebox under the bench at Harrow Square, exactly where Sal used to tuck the week's take when things were running too hot for handoffs. Nobody used that bench anymore. City was trying to make the park family-friendly, whatever that meant, but the old ghosts still knew their corners. The note was short. A name, a date, and the word enough. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Danny had been calling, texting too. Frank hadn't answered, not yet. Not because he didn't want to, but because what he had to say wouldn't fit into a phone screen. The kid didn't know what kind of house he'd walked into. He still thought this life could be reasoned with, still thought men like Frank could be reformed, maybe even redeemed. But Frank knew better. The world didn't want your change. It wanted your blood, your name, and your silence. In that order. He made 3 stops that day. 1, a print shop in Little Italy to pull public records on a man named Joseph G. Russo. Paper trail said he drowned in 2003. Frank now knew better. To a pawn shop on 18th Street. He gave back the watch he'd carried since the late 80s. The man behind the counter didn't ask why. 3, a cemetery just off Western Avenue, not for anyone in particular, just to walk, to look, to think. There was a name chiseled on one headstone, Elena Vale, his mother. He hadn't been back since her funeral. He knelt, wiped away a few leaves, looked up at the gray sky and said, "I don't know if I ever made you proud, but I kept my promises." The wind moved through the bare branches. That was her answer. That night, Frank didn't write in the notebook. He burned a page from it instead, one with a name he no longer wanted to carry. Then he sat down in his chair by the window and listened. The city was quiet, but something was coming. He could feel it. Danny showed up at dusk. No call, no warning. Just a knock on Frank's apartment door, like a kid stopping by for dinner, which in a different life he might have been. Frank opened the door and didn't speak, just stepped aside. Danny entered with shoulders too straight, breath too held, like he was rehearsing strength. He didn't sit until Frank did. Then he asked, "What's going on?" Frank didn't pretend not to understand. He just reached over to the coffee table and slid a photograph across the surface. The one with Benny Russo, the one that changed everything. Danny stared. "You told me he was dead." "He was," Frank said. "Just not when we thought." Danny looked up. "So what's this mean?" Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It means someone's pulling on a string, and if we don't cut it first, we're going to get strangled by it." Danny's jaw tightened. "You think this is about Sal?" Frank nodded once. "Your uncle made friends with the wrong men, bought loyalty with IOUs he never paid, the kind of debts that don't disappear even when the man does." "And you?" Danny asked. "What did you owe him?" Frank took a long breath. "I owed him you." Danny blinked. "I used to sit on the stoop with your uncle. I was barely 20. He watched my back, put me in rooms I had no business surviving in. He saved my life more than once. And when you were born, he asked me to keep you safe, just in case." Danny looked down, said nothing. Frank added, "I never told you, because I thought the best way to protect you was distance." Danny gave a bitter smile. "How's that working out?" Frank stood and walked to the window. The street below was slick with light rain. Tired cars crawling home. "You don't owe this life anything," Frank said quietly. "But you do owe yourself the truth." Danny left without saying goodbye. And Frank didn't try to stop him. He just sat back in the quiet, stared at the photograph, and wondered if the kid would be back before the wrong kind of men came knocking again. That night in his notebook, Frank wrote, "The hardest men I knew were boys who waited too long for someone to tell them the truth." And for the first time in years, he signed it. Frank. 3 nights passed, rain every one of them. The city felt soaked in memory, every streetlight casting shadows from decades ago, every puddle a mirror that didn't lie. Frank spent most of the time in his apartment, reading old notes, smoking cigarettes he told himself he'd quit, and staring at the same envelope over and over. Then came the call. Unlisted. 213A, M. He answered on the 3rd ring. A voice he hadn't heard in years said one word. "Warehouse." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Frank put on his coat, the old one with the stitched pocket, slipped a photograph inside. A second one this time, Sal and Benny, together on a dock in 1999. Smiling like they weren't sinking. The warehouse on Ashland hadn't changed. Same rusted signage, same broken window in the office up top. Frank parked 3 blocks down, walked in the dark, hands in pockets. There was no reason to expect safety, but he wasn't looking for safety anymore. Inside, the lights were low. 2 men stood by the far wall, one short, square, the other tall and loose-limbed. Frank recognized them both from the old days. But it was the 3rd figure, sitting on a crate, one leg swinging slightly, that made him stop. "Danny." "You came," Frank said. Danny didn't look surprised. just tired. "I got a call," he said. "Same as you." The shorter man lit a cigarette. "Let's keep this civil." Frank ignored him. He looked at Danny. "You trust them?" Danny shook his head. "I don't trust anyone, but I'm done being told things in pieces." The tall man stepped forward. "There's a tape," he said. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Of Benny," the man said. "Talking. Back in '03, right before he disappeared." Frank's throat tightened. He'd been there that week. He remembered the heat, the paranoia, the silence. "You got the tape?" Frank asked. The man smiled without warmth. "We got the man who has it." Frank turned to Danny. "This ain't yours." Danny stood. "Maybe not, but I'm in it now." Frank sighed, looked at the other men. "Let's hear it." The tape crackled when it played. The audio was bad, too much reverb, a hum under the voice. But it was Benny, no question. Laughing. Nervous, talking fast. "They don't know it was Sal. He set it up. All of it. I was just supposed to watch. But they'll come for me if this gets out." Frank closed his eyes. That was the sound of a man trying to disappear, and the sound of one more thread unspooling too far. When the tape stopped, no one spoke for a while. Then Danny asked the only question that mattered. "What do we do?" Frank looked at him, at the men, at the warehouse, at the life, and said, "We bury it." The tall man tensed. "That's not what we—" "It is," Frank interrupted, "because this thing, it's not justice. It's just rot, and every time we dig it up, we carry it somewhere else." The short one crossed his arms. "And what makes you think you get to decide?" Frank reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph, held it up. "I was there." Silence. Real heavy silence. Then the tall man nodded once. Tense, resigned. "Fine, but if it comes back up—" "It won't," Frank said, "because we're done." They left the tape behind, burned it in a metal drum behind the warehouse. No ceremony, no sentiment. Just fire and the hiss of the past turning to smoke. That night, Frank didn't write in the notebook. He threw it out the window and watched it land in the gutter. Rain carried the pages away. By morning, the warehouse was just another shadow among many, nothing left of the fire but a scorched barrel and the faint scent of burnt tape on Frank's coat. He walked along the river after sunrise. The city was waking up, headlights reflecting off puddles, vendors setting up carts, the first rumble of trains overhead. Frank moved slowly, hands deep in his pockets, coat collar turned up against the wind. Each step felt like it peeled away another version of himself. The fixer. The cleaner. The man who made hard choices on behalf of harder men. He stopped by a railing that overlooked the water, a place he used to visit in his 20s when the nights got loud and the blood ran hotter than the liquor. Back then, he used to imagine throwing his gun into the current, starting over, becoming a mechanic, a teacher, a cab driver, anything else. But he never did. The river was still here, still wide, still gray, still pretending to forget the things thrown into it. Frank pulled a lighter from his pocket. He flicked it once, twice, then lit a folded slip of paper, the last page from a letter Sal had written him once. Just a few lines faded with age. "You do what you have to do, Frankie, even when no one's watching, especially then." He let it burn between his fingers before dropping it into the river. The paper flared, danced, then vanished beneath the surface. That afternoon, Frank visited the only man he still owed something to, Ramon, an old bookmaker who used to launder cash through a dry cleaner in Humboldt Park. Ramon now lived in a small apartment above a deli and watched old movies on VHS. They didn't talk about money. They didn't talk about Benny or Sal or Danny. They just played chess. And when Frank lost, as he always did, Ramon said, "You always sacrifice your queen too early." Frank smiled. "She's tired." That evening, Frank took the long way home, walked past his old high school, past the alley where he took his first punch, past the bakery where he used to meet clients under a flickering sign. He was making a map of his life and deciding where to stop drawing. Frank stood at the bottom of the tenement steps where his father used to live. It hadn't changed much. Same rusted railing, same chipped paint, same stoop that held the weight of 100 tired conversations. He hadn't been back in almost 20 years. The apartment had long been empty, but the super let him in. Frank didn't offer a reason, and the man didn't ask. Inside, the walls were a shade yellower than memory, and the air held the scent of old newsprint and dust. The furniture was gone, but in the back bedroom closet on the highest shelf sat a box with his name still scribbled on the lid. Inside a knife, a photo of his mother, a pawn ticket from 1964, and a small red notebook that wasn't his. He opened it slowly. It was a list, names, dates, simple notes next to each. Some were crossed out, some circled, some ended with a single check mark. Frank realized it was his father's version of a ledger, a life measured in debts and reckonings. He sat down on the floor and read every page. At the end, his name appeared. Frank Vale, 1981, let him choose. Just that. No check mark, no circle. Just a line left open. Frank closed the notebook and sat in the quiet for a long time. Some things you inherit without asking. Others you walk toward. But very few ever give you the choice. Later, he stood in the kitchen, looking out the same window his father had stared through for years. The view hadn't improved. A chain-link fence, a bent street lamp, a slouching elm tree losing its leaves. But the light had softened. It was dusk again, and for once the shadows didn't feel like a warning. They just felt like evening. He left the notebook on the counter, took only the photo of his mother and the pawn ticket. Outside, he turned to look at the door one more time, then walked away and didn't look back. Frank hadn't meant to visit the church. But as he passed it, small, brick-faced, tucked between two crumbling storefronts on the south side, his feet slowed and his hand reached for the iron gate without thinking. It was the same one Sal used to drop envelopes behind. Same one Frank would visit on Sunday mornings, not for confession, but to sit in the back row and listen to the priest's voice echo through the hollow quiet like it might mean something. The doors were open, not for service, just for silence. Inside, it was empty except for one old man lighting candles and a janitor humming as he mopped near the altar. Frank sat in the last pew. Didn't kneel, didn't pray, just watched the stained glass window above the pulpit, St. Michael in full battle, sword raised, face blank. He remembered being told as a boy that saints didn't win with force. They won by standing still while others fled. He didn't know if it was true. But it made sense now. After a while, the janitor walked past and said, "You all right, brother?" Frank nodded, just remembering. The janitor smiled. "You picked a good place for that." Frank stayed until the candles burned low. Then he lit one more, for Benny maybe, or Sal, maybe for himself. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't want forgiveness. Just a moment where the weight didn't feel so loud. That night back at his apartment, he made pasta with anchovies and breadcrumbs, an old Sicilian recipe. Sal used to call it poor man's gold. He sat at the table with a plate, a glass of wine, and no sound but the ticking of the wall clock. He didn't write in the notebook. Didn't need to. Some things were better left unsaid. Some things had already been answered. The letter arrived on a Thursday. No stamp, just a fold of paper tucked under Frank's door like something meant only for him. It read, "You're square." No name, no signature. Just 2 words that reached across 3 decades of rooms, favors, phone calls, disappearances, and sleepless nights. Frank stood in his doorway with the letter in his hand, the hallway behind him silent, the world suddenly quieter than it had been in years. He didn't call Danny. He didn't need to. The kid had made his own path. Frank had done what he could, steered him toward the edge, but let him walk it alone. He hoped that meant something, even if Danny never said it out loud. The next day, Frank cleared out the bottom drawer of his dresser. Inside were photos, receipts, folded napkins with names scrawled in pencil, and matchbooks from restaurants that didn't exist anymore. He burned most of it in a ceramic bowl on the balcony. The smoke rose into the city like it had somewhere to be. He spent the evening in the chair by the window. No notebook. No television. Just the sound of the city, soft and slow, and the feeling that for the first time, nothing was waiting around the corner. Not a job. Not a threat. Not a past pretending to be present. Just him, in a room, in a life. The sun set slow that night, casting the walls in gold. Frank didn't move. He just breathed. In. Out. Across the room, the old ledger, his father's red one, still sat on the counter. He hadn't touched it since the day he found it. Now he walked over and opened it. Flipped to the last page. And in his father's hand, he saw it again. Frank Vale, 1981, let him choose. Frank smiled, took a pen from his pocket, and drew a simple check mark next to his name. Then he closed the book, turned out the light, and let the quiet take him home. Sleep Stories, Restless Minds. Thank you for joining us tonight on the quiet side of the ledger. This was a tale of old debts, quiet choices, and the slow kind of peace that only time can give. We hope Frank's journey helped ease your thoughts and settle your mind. If this story helped you rest, feel free to return anytime. There's always another quiet night and always another story waiting. Until next time, sleep well and may your mind find stillness.